Hello and welcome back. So we're continuing with the LJ Peretti pipe restoration, and when last we saw the Peretti stummel, it was being dunked into an alcohol bath. It actually has come out very nicely, nice and clean, much cleaner than it was when it went in. The grain still isn't anything to get too excited about, but that's okay. I think we're going to be able to still make something of it. There's some interesting little bird's eye here, and there's some wildness going on here. It's going to be all right. It's not going to be a showpiece, but it'll look nice by the time we're done. So it's got enough interest that I don't want to lose the grain completely. So the next step is going to be to, I should tell you what I did after this point. So I took it out of the alcohol bath. I let it soak actually for about 8 hours. I did not let it go overnight. I let it go for about 8 hours. Took it out and I just wiped off the alcohol. Used paper towels and did a fairly forceful job of wiping it off, so to try to scrub it a bit. I also used some sort of wadded up paper toweling to scrub out the tobacco chamber a bit, and some bristle pipe cleaners to get down through the airway in the shank. And having done all that, it's actually pretty clean now. And even I don't know if you can see, the rim has really cleaned up nicely as well. Unfortunately, there are still these knocks, and they're even more prominent now that the dirt is gone. You can see the damage that's been done to the rim. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to top this off. I'm going to actually decrease the size of the rim by just a bit, just to get below those markings, so that we've got clean briar at the top. Now to do that, I want to be careful. I want to make sure that I don't change the proportions of the pipe too much, and also it's really important that as I'm doing it that I'm keeping this top surface as perpendicular to, well, I want the cut to be basically straight across here. I don't want to put an angle in any way onto the top of this tobacco chamber, so I need to make sure that I'm cutting perpendicular to this axis on the tobacco chamber. And to do that, I'm going to basically use sandpaper and a flat surface to rub this back and forth until I get it to where I want, and then I'll use finer grit sandpaper to polish things. So just to kind of demonstrate that in a very, you could probably just use your imagination for this, but I've got strips of various sandpapers. This is 220 grit. And this is going to be placed on a flat surface. Now I'm using a piece of plywood here for demonstration. MDF works really well for this. I actually have a granite surface plate that I'm going to use off camera, just because currently it's covered in chaos and I can't get to it, so I have to do some cleaning before I can do this step. But what we'll do is I will actually glue the sandpaper down. You can just hold it in place if you're using a piece of MDF or plywood. And let me just slide this over a bit. I don't want to saturate everything because of the light color. And then you will take this, and being really careful to keep pressure downward and keep the face of this flush against the sandpaper, just start to gently, well, not so gently really, but you start to sand. Now as I'm doing that, I can feel this is starting to rock, and that's because I'm actually in a seated position as I'm making this video, and I'm not able to apply enough pressure down here. So I'm not going to do very much of this, but you can see just that little bit has actually cleared up the rim nicely. And a few more strokes, if this had some significant charring to it, just a few strokes like this can take the charring off. The problem is that you also are sanding through any finish that was here. So if this is a stained pipe, which this one currently we've removed any stain, but if this was stained, then you'd have to restain this rim, and we're going to stain the whole stummel, so that's not an issue. Anyway, that's the plan. So I will be doing this starting at 220 grit until I get below where these dings are. Oh, sorry, where these dings are. And that's going to be, I'm not real good at judging inches, but it certainly is going to be just about maybe under 1/8 of an inch. After that's done with the 220, so we're going to use the 220 as our sort of shaping tool. So once this is removed, that wood, we will then begin to polish, and we'll do that jumping to 320 grit, and then I'll go through 400 and 600. And when I do the 600, that's going to be my final grit for everything. So I will also sand over the entire stummel with 600, just to make sure that we've gotten any surface dirt off and that it's prepared for staining. I will not sand over where the LJ Peretti imprint is, because that's actually somewhat faded at this point, and you can see we're missing part of the L and the J. I don't want to sand through any of that, so I will be careful to avoid that completely. I'll sand around it, but I will leave the stamping intact. And when we're done with that, we'll be ready to apply some stain. So I'll bring you back at that point after she's all topped and polished, and we'll talk about the next step. Okay, so we are done topping the pipe, and I'll insert a picture here that shows the granite surface plate that has the different grits of sandpaper attached to it, just so you get an idea of what I did. And if you're asking yourself, why in the world does he have a granite surface plate, you should be asking yourself, why don't I have a granite surface plate? Because it's really one of the most useful tools that I have. It's a perfectly dead flat surface. You know, you could use something like a table saw top, or a piece of MDF, as I said, but it's just it's solid as a rock, because it is a rock. It's very, very stable surface, and it is dead flat. It never moves, and it's just something that I use all the time for many, many different things. Anyway, I'm fortunate enough to have one of those, and it works great for this. So I took off that top, and hopefully you can see now that we've gotten rid of all the dings, which is great. Sanded this down to 600, so it's nice and smooth. Ran 600 over everything. I did go very lightly over the stamping, just to sort of make sure that I'm breaking that surface a little bit, because I want to get the stain in there. Likewise, I didn't mention, but we've got this genuine Algerian briar marking on this side that I wanted to be careful with as well. So I sanded all of this, but I just went lightly over those. So everything has been sanded and pretty much ready to stain, although I forgot about the fill. So I did pick the fill out. I did that off camera. It's a very simple process. Just take a sharp needle or a dental tool or something like that, and just get in there and pick it out. Sometimes it softens up with the alcohol. I did try it when I took it out of the alcohol bath, and this one was just very tiny and sort of very tough to get out. Unfortunately, there's always good news and bad news. In doing that, I created more of a problem, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this into focus for you to see it, but as I was picking at it, the pick slipped and actually put a bit of a scratch in there. Now, it's deep enough that I don't want to sand it out, because it's going to change the shape of the bowl. It's not terribly deep, but my fingernail catches in it, so it's not just a surface scratch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill both the spot where the fill was as well as that scratch, and then we will sand this down using the same process that I used to top this. So we'll start out probably not at 220 grit, but maybe at the 320, just to get that flat again, because I'm going to be filling it with an epoxy, and then we'll go to the finer grits until we're at 600. But you've seen these two-part 5-minute epoxies before. You get a hardener and an epoxy coming out of each side, and then you mix the two together, and you have 5 minutes to use them. Well, you've got a little bit less than 5 minutes to use them, because they do start to set up in that time. Now, that's great, but I wouldn't want to sand it after 5 minutes. I'm actually going to let it go overnight, which is why I'm trying to get it done in this this portion of the video rather than waiting until the next one, because I just don't want to have another overnight step. So I'm just going to mix this thoroughly. Now you can mix in briar dust, and you saw in the picture there is plenty of briar dust on the sandpaper. I could go and get some of that. I will probably save that, because there's times when I want to use it. But for a small fill like this, the epoxy, I'm not sure if it actually can pick up the stain, but it essentially dries clear, slightly yellowish. So for a small fill, it's just going to be allowing the background colors to come through. And for the most part, for something small like this, it's not really a noticeable effect. It's much less noticeable than those horrible tan fills that you get on pipes, and I don't know why a better material than that has not been discovered, because that tan stuff, whatever it is just, it's a wood putty, I guess. It's just horrible. It would be better to use black. If they filled it black, then at least it could match in with some of the grain or something. Okay, so I've got the epoxy mixed up, and I'm just going to use this needle here because I'm doing small amounts. I don't want to cover the pipe in epoxy. I just want to dribble it into those holes as carefully as I can. And I do want to make sure that I'm filling. And we don't want to have any air pockets in there. And obviously I'm going to be a bit proud of the surface, and that's okay. That's what I want, because I'm going to come back and sand it smooth. Basically sand it flush. Okay, I'm just trying to make sure that that is flowing into the cracks. There we go, and that will level out. What we've done so far is or what we've done recently is filled in that, replace that fill that you saw me remove last time and fill with epoxy. And that is, I allowed that to set up actually. Normally I would make sure that it was at least 12 hours. I had other things to do, so this actually sat for 48 hours before I got to it. And then I've sanded that down, starting at 320 grit, and I went all the way back up to 600. So everything is now sanded to 600. It's all nice and smooth. That fill, as you can see, it's a bit darker than the surrounding grain, but we're probably going to fix that as we stain this, because we're going to use a contrast stain. The important thing is it's not that awful light tan color that's going to show up no matter what we do. So I think that's actually going to be an improvement. There are no other fills. I've prepared the pipe for staining. Now I've got the stem back in, but I've masked it off with just some blue painter's tape to avoid getting stain on the stem. I've also, at least temporarily, masked off the stampings on this, and the reason I'm doing that is that I don't want to get a lot of black stain into the lines of the stamping and then have difficulty getting it back out again. So that's just a precautionary measure. It's not really critical. I just don't want to have to spend a lot of time trying to clean the stain out of there. And we're going to use a two-step staining process. We're going to stain the pipe black first, and the idea with that is that the black is hopefully going to get absorbed in, and it's going to stain the grain, and then we're going to sand that down. We're actually going to wipe it off first with alcohol to remove a lot of the stain, and then I'll sand it again with 600 grit. So theoretically, we'll just be leaving stain in the grain portions and not in the softer non-grain wood, which will sand out more easily. We will then come back in and we will stain this with an oxblood stain, which is going to leave a light brownish red coloring to it. What I'm really striving to do is, since the grain on this pipe is not terribly prominent, I want to try to accent it a bit more, bring it out more, and hopefully create an interesting effect. So doing that contrast stain within a relatively light oxblood stain on top of that, I'm hoping will achieve some effect that at least brings some interest to this piece of briar that otherwise is somewhat boring. So to do that, we're going to be using these stains. These are fibing leather dyes. They're quite commonly used in pipe making and pipe refurbishment. These are great products. I believe they're aniline dyes, so they're quite difficult to wash out or to get off your skin if you get them on your skin, so I'll be wearing gloves to make sure that doesn't happen. They're an alcohol-based dye, so they will the solvent very quickly will flash off, and in fact you can, if you're, for various reasons, you can actually flash it off with a flame, so you can light it on fire and burn off the alcohol, and you'll see guys doing that if you watch other pipe making videos or pipe refurbishment videos. I may do that with the red, but with the black I really want to try to get this to set into the grain, so I'm going to let it dry naturally. To apply this, I'm going to be using just a simple pipe cleaner, fold it over, dip it in the dye, and then put it on this. I've masked off the stem just to avoid getting dye on that. I am not going to mask off the bowl because I want to be able to get right to the edge of the bowl. And since this is not bare wood down here, this is a smoked pipe and there's some cake. If I get a little bit in there, I can sand it out without any major issue. If it was bare wood, I would probably put something in there just to protect it a bit should I misstep, but I'm going to be really careful to be able to get right around the rim. And if I were to tape this off, I'm not going to be able to get right to that edge without kind of forcing some down. So I think the tape's just going to be more trouble than it's worth. Okay, so what we will do is we'll apply the dye, and then I'm going to let it dry on its own, which will only take about 10 minutes or so. Then I will come back with some alcohol. Actually, I'm going to pre-wet the pipe, so I'll get to that in a second. I'll come back with alcohol and wipe off any dye that comes off easily with the alcohol, and then I will sand to 600 and repeat the process with the ox blood. I might bring you back at that point and show you the ox blood, show you what the pipe looks like sanded, and show you the ox blood going on, but I'm not going to bore you with a lot of stain drying time and things like that. Now, because I want this to really set into the grain as much as possible, I'm going to try something that I haven't tried before, which is I'm going to pre-wet the pipe with just alcohol. And the idea here is that we're just going to be opening up the pores and getting it ready to receive that dye, and hopefully making for a somewhat more efficient transfer of the dye into the grain. So this is just alcohol on a shop cloth, and the truth is it's probably going to dry before I even can get the stain out, but we'll start. You see I've put on gloves because I don't want to have stain on my hands. This stuff will stay on forever. And we'll just take a bit of this on the pipe cleaner, and then I'm going to move this aside so I don't spill it, which would be quite tragic. That out of the way. And you can see this is already drying very rapidly, but hopefully we've at least opened up the grain a bit. And we will just go around, and I will probably pause at some point very soon so that you're not having to watch this whole process. Well, we're done now. So I've stained the whole pipe black and then wiped off the excess with alcohol, and then I went and sanded it down to, or up to 600 grit. Actually, for the most part, just used 600 grit. There were a few spots where I decided to drop down to 400 and then come back to 600, but for the most part, we're done. The only other thing I did was after removing the masks over the stampings, I went back in and quickly stained those and quickly wiped off with the alcohol, again trying to avoid filling in the stamping too much with black, but at the same time making sure that we didn't have an odd spot there that was masked off completely. And I still have a bit of work to do here in terms of sanding, but I wanted to show you where we're at. I was going to do the whole idea here was to do a contrast stain, so stain the grain black and then come back with a lighter red stain to sort of fill in and provide a background for those details. But actually, as I'm looking at this, and I'm going to wet this down with some alcohol to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, the grain has actually come out quite nicely, and I like the sort of natural briar background, so I may not do any additional staining on this. I don't know how well that's going to come up in the light here, but you can see there is certainly a lot more happening here with the grain. Even on the bottom here, which was relatively dull before, we're getting some detail coming out. And really, it's a bit wild. It's not anything traditional, but it's quite attractive, I think, and it's filled in the whole pipe. So I'm pretty happy with the way this looks right now. I don't think I'm going to do the additional staining. This will all. The alcohol is wetting it. Once it's buffed and the wax finishes on, it will look similar. So it gives us an idea of what the final pipe will look like. So I think I'm going to call this finished. I'm going to go over, well, not quite finished. I'm going to look and just make sure there's no spots that require additional sanding before I buff it and polish it and get it waxed. I'm not going to go through the buffing process on this pipe. Just because there's a lot to talk about with buffing, and I think I'd like to do a separate video on that, talk about the different methods that you can use. So what I will do now is I will go ahead, reassemble this with the stem, put it on the buffer, bring it up to a polish, add the carnauba wax, and bring it back and show you what the finished product looks like. So stay tuned. Well, my friends, we are done with the LJ Peretti pipe, and this brings another project to its conclusion. So I did decide to not do any additional staining, as I was mentioning, and I buffed this out on the buffing wheel. I did, let's see, a triple E buff, which is a relatively coarse buff that just sort of takes out any of the remaining sanding scratches. I then buffed it with white diamond, which polishes the wood, burnishes and polishes it, and then put a coating of carnauba wax on both the bowl and the stem. And you can see that, you know, I am quite pleased with the way this grain turned out. I mean, considering what we were starting with, this was really a very dull, boring pipe. And yeah, granted, it's not some wonderful classic grain pattern that people are going to go crazy about, but it's got interest. And I think that adding the ox blood would have just sort of muddled things up a bit much. I think it's nice to have that dark grain standing out against the natural briar. And you can see it's just really, I think it's come out quite well. The stamping, I did wind up highlighting the stamping a bit, but hey, I think it's still fine. And one thing that's of particular note for this pipe is that, if you recall, there was a fill. And I think it's very difficult to find that fill in this grain. The epoxy has blended in really nicely. If you remember, it was right in here. And yeah, it just kind of fits in with some of that wild burl that's going on there. I know the light's glaring there a bit, but if you know where it is, you can find it. But otherwise, it just blends right in. So I'm happy with this. As I mentioned, this is going to be a Christmas gift, so I sure hope the recipient is happy with it. And I hope you've enjoyed watching this. So we'll be starting another project in the not too distant future. I'm planning on doing a retort video, probably sometime in January, and after that we'll be moving on to another pipe. So I hope you're enjoying this. If you're not a subscriber, please do subscribe so you can keep up on the projects as they come along. Feel free to comment. Love to hear from you. And otherwise, take care of yourself, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye.